Let's get busy with the topic for today. We began with Mark's wonderful outline of where the call to discipleship fits into the grand scheme of things. And actually, Mark and I are still reflecting of how to put this wonderful graph in the context of what some people call the cultural mandate, what I would call the creation mandate, the purpose of God creating this universe. Somehow we have to get Genesis 1:26, 1:27, and then also several sections in Genesis 2 into this scheme, just to kind of look at a map of where are we with the call to discipleship. What should it serve, etc. What I want to do this morning is to argue that at every stage of this process that Mark developed and that our other contributors yesterday helped us clarify some aspects of, humility is perhaps one of the foundational characteristics, fragrances, aromas that should be part of this whole process, including the creation mandate. We will not be able to conform, to collaborate, to enter into God's grand design of being human beings created in His image in this world unless we get a sense of that. And I don't have time this morning to develop this particular aspect, but I'm going to throw it ahead as a characteristic, namely, that God, at heart, is a humble being. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burdened, for I am humble of heart." And I would say He is describing a characteristic of the eternal co-creator of this universe. So when you look at a butterfly, when you look at a flower, when you look at the dignity of a human being, you see the fruit of humility. Now, I understand one of the characteristics of God is that of love. But sometimes love goes in one ear and out the other. And so to describe it as a humble study of what God would want to put forth in creating a human being, that is the fruit of humility, is a new and helpful aspect for me. And obviously we will need to describe, maybe not define, but describe what is biblical humility as we move forward. But I would argue then that Jesus, not only in His earthly life as the Eved Yahweh, as the servant of Yahweh, who has come to serve and to be of benefit to us, to give us life, but when Jesus comes as judge to put all injustice, all evil, ultimately right, He arises as a humble judge who will not act out of any other motive but humility. So I know I'm stretching you right now by presenting such a large scheme in the characteristic description of God, but as we are called to reflect God as image bearers, I believe that the characteristic of humility is one that is foundational and pervasive. And I've experienced that a little bit in my life, what happens when biblical humility sets in our lives. One person once said that the ocean is a wonderful illustration of humility because all waters flow to it. And contrast that with being a little lake on a very high mountain in the Swiss Alps. You are sitting high and mostly dry. You are there, you're on your own, you're isolated, and everything flows away from you. You have your personal peace and prosperity that Francis Schaeffer talked about. But if you're the ocean, if you're at the lowest point, maybe the Dead Sea, all kinds of things flow to you. So the prosperity, the spiritual and human prosperity in a disposition of humility is one of exceeding wealth. Not material wealth as much as fellowship, connectedness, receiving, being able to listen, being teachable, etc. I'm going to take you there in just a minute. And so I want to win you for the conviction that as we reflect on discipleship, and as I am certain God's Spirit is right now involved in your lives to actually humble you, that is not by chance, by accident. It is not really that God doesn't know your life and therefore has forgotten you in this humble, difficult state, but actually that is part of the purposes of God for your lives. And perhaps you can think about where God has you in your life right now, and to see that what I'm bringing you is in some ways just a biblical foundation for what God is doing in your lives. A description of God already spoke about it. He already knows about your state. In fact, that is His plan. Not to humiliate you, not to annihilate you, not to put you into a place of nothingness, but to enrich your life with a disposition of life, with an attitude of life that begins and ends with this heart of humility, whereby you can become very rich in God's ways. So let me take you there. This is a pretty long trajectory that I hope to take you in. I'm basically using Peter as a case study. I'm doing that to please Mark. He loves case studies. I have no idea what case studies are about, but the life of Peter is really Exhibit A for God's, more specifically the Son of God's, Michelangelo kind of chiseling, of creating a sculpture of the life of Peter that is marked by humility. And so that's what I'm basically going to do in the next 3 or 4 hours, is to trace that work of Christ. And my assumption is that as we are followers of Christ, He is shaping us into that similar form, that Christ-like form that we've already heard about a little bit, which will mark and characterize the path of discipleship, the being shaped into the temple, and mark godly biblical leadership to facilitate that growth. So it touches on every particular area that we have already looked at. Now, I want to briefly go into the question of humility in the Greco-Roman world. You do maybe have the outline of this talk. If you do, that's great. I'm not going to follow that precisely here, but roughly there will be a correspondence between that. The reason why we need to begin with Greco-Roman understanding of humility is that is very much a prevailing attitude towards humility in our world today, and I think it is a false perception of humility in the Christian church as well. So let me describe what I mean by that. Humility in the Greco-Roman world is basically one of weakness. You do not want to aspire as a Stoic, as a Pharisaic person in the Gentile or the Jewish world, to humility. Humility is for the weak, for those who cannot have enough strength of personality, of presence, of authority to create the space for themselves. So it's for servants, it's maybe for slaves, but it's something that you would not want to aspire to. It is an expression of spinelessness, of going with whatever the powers around you do. So if you're pushed left, you move left. If you're pushed right, you're pushed right. And especially for women then, it's the sense of being a doormat. It's a sense of whatever the powers are, I have to go with them. So if you were a Stoic in the Greek world, or a Pharisee, or a good standing Jewish person in Palestinian Judaism at the 1st century AD, you would want to say that's about as far a characteristic I want to stay away from as possible, because if I pursue humility, I will be the underdog. So humility is something you want to stay away from, and that's the counterintuitive fact that not only Jesus himself, but his disciples are shaped into humble servants, servant leaders, serving temple builders, in which that aspect of humility arises all over the place. But here's the problem. You've just heard me describe the Greek and Jewish definition of humility, and that is taken laterally into the Christian church so as to say, be humble, Christian disciple. And that means be a doormat, be pushed around, be nice, be conciliatory in quotation marks, accommodate whatever powers are around you. And if you think of yourself in a Slavic church, Slavic traditionally, in the mentality of a Slavic church, you are doomed. So I am right now saying this description of humility is a Greek description, a Gentile description of humility particularly, that has been taken into the Christian church. And when we hear Jesus saying, be humble, we use that definition, enter it, and we never ask the question of what is the biblical understanding of humility. I postulate that biblical humility is stronger than pride. It is more stable than pride. It has more standing power than pride. It has some very interesting characteristics, but it has nothing to do with being a doormat and pushed around. So we have to work on that. Obviously, I'm doing a rough sketch right now just to kind of loosen you up and to say, are you importing in your Christian churches, in your description of humility, Greek thought? And you hear the word humility all over in the New Testament, and you use that definition and think you are a good Christian. You are a good disciple of Jesus because you never raise your head. You never question. You always accommodate. And you feel pretty miserable, but probably misery is good to be a follower of Christ. Especially as a leader, then, if I tell you that you're supposed to be a humble servant leader, and you've already mentioned that, what a challenge that is in your church. Then we have a real problem on our hands. So, Greco-Roman, Jewish definition that are alien to a biblical understanding of humility, and in the church, a unreflected, undifferentiated, non-biblical understanding of this foreign, alien definition of humility. That's kind of the framework, and we are basically going to try in the next minutes to crystallize with Exhibit A, with Peter. What is Christian, Christ-like humility? And in what way does this Christ-like humility stand in direct opposition to being a doormat, to being a nobody, to being pushed around? What is it? And it's a frustrating thing initially to try and find your way there. But if my thesis is right, that God at heart is a humble creator, and that in his humility he created such beauty as animals and flowers, and even the crown of his creation, human beings, who are to reflect him. There's something extremely dignified and beautiful about it, but we have not found access to it. I have to tell you one disheartening thing before we move on. Even if we, in this room, capture what humility according to Christ really is, we're in for a very difficult road ahead. Because when you go back to your church, the old understanding of strength and leadership versus humility will still be there. So maybe you are being shaped into a round circle as you are here, and you're capturing something. I can't believe that humility is that. That's wonderful. That's something to aspire to. And then you go back and you are a round person and you're being fit into a square box. So I think you and I will suffer with this for the rest of our lives. Even as we capture what this humility is and how that facilitates personal and corporate growth in discipleship and maturity, how it helps for us to be temple builders, how leadership particularly has to be shaped by such a characteristic of humility, we will suffer. Because our cultures, whatever the particular shape they have, will push back to a Greco-Roman understanding and will say, oh, so you want to be a doormat, so you want to be weak, so you want to be soft, you want to be pushed around. Well, let's try that in a Slavic world. Let's try that in a military American school. And so I am sobered and realistic. But I still feel I need to lead you into that pain, to grasp something of what humility looks like in God's understanding. And so I want to give you a very encouraging thing here, and namely, this is intentional graphic. These are staircases downward. I call it the downward mobility of Peter. So Peter has a plan for Jesus. And that plan for Jesus is to be victorious and strong in Jerusalem, to throw out the Romans and to establish a theocracy in Israel. That's Jesus' plan for Peter. Peter's plan for Jesus, sorry. Jesus' plan for Peter is downward mobility. Now, Jesus never says, go do something where I haven't gone. In fact, this downward ladder is something that Jesus has pursued before Peter, but as a disciple, he pulls him down with him. And that's a disheartening part. You don't like that. This is intentional steps down. It feels like death. It feels like utter nakedness. It feels like utter defenselessness. It feels like the little resources you have to defend yourself and to make a name for yourself and to have some elbows and to say, I am somebody, I'm a pastor, I'm a teacher, I'm a leader, will be taken from you. Just as Peter was. Now, this is discouraging only if you don't see that Jesus never takes us down in order to shame us, in order to make us powerless, when in fact, He always takes you to the hard places because he sees the life on the other side of that. He sees the liberty on the other side of that. He sees what he wants to give you and you resist it because you have a wrong definition of humility. So I predict that you will not like this, that you will say, this is terrible. I think Peter had that feeling, that intuitive feeling, this is a harrowing road. Now, I also predict this, that many of you feel like you have reached the bottom of being humbled. You are in the basement. Maybe a few years ago you were still up in the attic. And somehow through life circumstances and through reading scripture, you have kind of fallen down one story after the next. And you are crawling on the basement floor. It has a little bit of water on it. It doesn't smell very good down there. You're not noticed. You suffer. And now comes the terrible thing in your life. God has a trap door that he opens. You have to go further down. And you say, haven't I let go enough? Haven't I been disrobed enough? And that trapdoor is not the last place that goes further down. Maybe that trapdoor in your life experience is somewhere around here. Now, as we go through this, roughly the years that I've attached to these stages in Peter's life roughly relate to his age, plus minus. And so if you are maybe 34, you have a long history in front of yourself. And it will have something of this characteristic because I think God's Spirit is going in a similar direction with all of his disciples. Because he cares about maturing in discipleship, because he cares about the growth in the temple, and because he cares about godly leadership that can actually steer between being a marshmallow and a doormat and being a czar, to being a truly biblically humble servant leader. And that's where we're headed slowly here. Also, I have attached some scriptures here, and that's the incredible thing. What this indicates here is Mark 9 and 10 is Jesus teaching about that. And I know you have learned some things about humility, maybe with this wrong definition. But do you see that this is stage one of a long process? Stage one is to understand cognitively how humility in the hand of Christ looks very different to humility as defined by our culture and our environment. But do you see how far Peter has to go? And so I'm going to take you through these stages, and basically this will then represent these 7 points. So there's nothing new here. So this is kind of the visual description of the step down. These are the points that I will go through. So I will go from 1 to 7, very systematic, numeric, step by step. But this represents stages in Peter's life. And I want to tell you this. That's why I'm encouraged. That's why I'm bold to draw you into this. The end product, if you want to speak about an end product in Jesus' discipleship work with Peter, is not someone who crawls on the ground, who's pushed around, who feels like nothing, like apologizing for the air that he or she breathes, a little wallflower on the wall. Nothing like it. Peter, at the end of his life, is healthy. He is himself. He is full of trust in the goodness of God. He does not have to prove his authority. He can draw younger leaders to come alongside him. There's a peace. There's a health. There's a restfulness. There's a confidence in the reality of God. That's why I'm confident to encourage you to go down there with Jesus. Because the outcome is none in this room to be anything less of a person than you are right now. But you flourish. You become a healthy human being. You grow into your giftedness and the calling that you long to inhabit without the false support of developing your own profile by your own efforts. So that health comes on certain conditions. And the condition is you don't help yourself to create a name for yourself, to develop a profile. So let's go there a little bit. So I will have the numbers in the following slides, and I have to go relatively quickly since we don't have that much time. But let's just follow Peter in what Jesus' plan for his life is. And we know that Jesus is shaping a key apostolic bedrock of witness. This is part of my argument in this book, that this is the shaping of a witness that testifies to the foundation stone of Christ, and the bedrock of Jesus is being built upon by the apostles as foundation stones, Peter being a significant one of that. And yet, Peter is also a reflection of Christ. Maybe you have wondered why Jesus never wrote anything. Anything that we know he wrote was in sand. But perhaps you concluded too quickly that Jesus never wrote. He didn't want to write a manifesto or a red book. He wanted to write a human being. He wanted to write a transformed human being that people could read and say, wow, where did that come from? Who shaped you? So, living letter, I used that word last night. And so, here in Mark 9:35 and 10:13, we see Jesus working on some particular discipleship passages. They are central in the Gospel of Mark, but they are also central for the other Gospels, Matthew and Luke, and they are supplemented by John in a wonderful way. And the point is, you think this way, my way is different. That's the contrast, antithesis. And so actually Jesus gives us an understanding that the perspective of leadership, of authority, of power, of influence from the outside world then and from the outside world now is not the way Jesus goes about things. And we need to remember, Jesus is not starting a new school. He's not developing a new movement. It is the eternal Son of God describing how life is meant to be. And so here in Mark 9:35 to 36, Jesus speaks about that. I wonder if one of you could just briefly read Mark 9:35 to 36, and for us just to kind of get that into our minds. I have a picture of children playing at the Sea of Gennesareth here, Galilee, to kind of underline that. So Mark 9:35 to 36, if somebody could just read that, and we just keep that in our mind as we cumulatively sense, what is Jesus doing with Peter? And then obviously there's the famous description of letting the children come. Now, we don't have time to study that, but the place of a child was one of marginalized importance. So Jesus is doing a visualized lesson with that child. He's not saying be childish, but he is saying become childlike. And what is a child? A child is a vulnerable creature. It is dependent. It is not strong in itself. Have that as an attitude, as a disposition, as an inclination of your own heart. So Jesus begins to turn the expectation upside down, but as you know, this is only the beginning of a long story, a long trajectory. We don't have time to go into Mark 10:42 to 45, but there Jesus more specifically says, you lead differently than the leaders of the Gentiles who are suppressive. There are some very strong terms used in the Mark 10 passage. They are using authority to gain something for themselves. They're exploiting, they're drawing, they're vampires in some ways. And you as leaders must be very different. You must serve. And obviously the climax of this whole section in chapter 10 is 10:45. For the Son of Man has not come to be served, even though he would have the right to do so, but he came to serve and to give himself as a litron, as a ransom for many, Isaiah 53:8. Now you see something very interesting that redirects your mind and your attitude. You're not here to benefit yourself. You're not here to gain something, to make a name for yourself, to be somebody. You're here to benefit somebody else. You're here to give life, to facilitate life, just like the Creator makes a butterfly in his imagination and his ability, out of his humility, to bring something forth. So you, as a discipler, as a teacher, as a fellow Christian, as a leader, whoever you are, your purpose in life is to benefit somebody, to give something. You see again the ocean aspect to that. You're not supposed to sit high and dry and say, I hope people notice me. I'm so important. I've published a book. Oh, all nonsense. You're supposed to be down here to say, how can I serve? Do you see that Jesus in 10:45 says, I'm going to stoop so low that I will look up at the lowest, so that even the lowest will not feel disenfranchised, feel left out. So already now, and we're only in stage 1, Jesus is describing a new way of looking at existence, and then obviously at Christian life and Christian ministry that is very subversive, very transformational, and very different. Now, Peter, I did have the text here, but I forgot that. And then here, this is the rulers of the Gentiles. Peter would have said until this stage, Jesus, I think this is fabulous. This is brilliant. You are subversive. You are turning this whole cultural thing around, and I'm supposed to be a servant and benefit other people. But now Jim Crook is coming in, and he says, what has not happened to you, don't try to do as a leader. So Jesus gets under Peter's skin by saying, let me put on some servant disposition and clothes. Let me kneel down and do the job of what a slave or a servant would do when the master would come home with dusty feet. Let me wash your feet as a sign of subservience. And so this is one of Rembrandt's etchings, and I wonder if you capture here the discomfort that Peter has. His face is one of utter frozenness. what's happening to me. And maybe there's a mixture of, Jesus, you're the master, you're the teacher, you shouldn't be doing this. But I would suspect there's something worse going on. You're getting too close. I need a little bit of private space. Don't you know the dignity of human private space? I mean, how do you feel when somebody gets so close to you, you smell their bad breath and you kind of back off a little bit? They don't understand space. And Jesus seems to, like it's a saying in the United States, he seems to be getting into your face. Intentionally breaking through the private sphere that nobody should unless he is a good God who's trying to free you from the crust of self, self-defense, self-profiling, self-justification, all of the resistance that we have when approached by love, by truth, by radical transformation. But see, Jesus' plan for Peter necessitates the foot washing. And so I'm convinced that Jesus is involved in that in your lives. Now, if you have been abused, sexually abused, verbally abused, physically abused, this is a very, very tender and difficult place. Because that's precisely where you were wounded. And so you have a double problem. Not only private sphere, but that's where you were violated, in that point. And that's why I'm saying, unless it is the good healer who gets that close to you, you should not tolerate it. But because he is the good healer, who will heal you rather than violate you in your vulnerability, let him love you to that deep degree. Let him disarm you from your defenses and your anger and your pain and your sense of where was God when I was in that vulnerable place. So you can see where this would lead, where we need to talk with our counseling fellows, brothers and sisters, and learn from them how to be very careful on this point, because sometimes Christian teachers are a little bit simplistic about true things that have to be handled very carefully. And here we have one example. Here's another description, and I like to go into different art forms, different depictions of that, because you get different aspects of that. It's very, very interesting what is going on in various pictures. So Peter is not very happy either. The next point in the steps of Peter's experience of humility is not very on the surface. I actually included that only later, because it doesn't pertain to Peter directly. Jesus doesn't work on Peter at this stage. Jesus goes to a place where he needs to go to benefit Peter without Peter knowing. God will take you into places to benefit somebody that person will not know. I don't know if you get this. At the very heart of what Jesus does for Peter, he does something that Peter doesn't realize that he needs. Jesus goes alone. The last stretch, he goes all by himself. They sleep. They are not present. They are not aware. So part of becoming a humble servant leader is to be in very lonely places for the sake of your spouse, for the sake of a friend, for the sake of somebody who is clueless of how they hurt you, how they have mistreated you, and you are before the face of God finding forgiveness for that person, all by yourself. So this is an amazing thing here. Peter, we're not going to go into all of the denial of Peter, but this is Rembrandt's depiction of a rather innocent hand. What are you talking about? I don't know the man. In fact, Peter goes so far as to swear an oath. By oath, I don't know the man. So now it becomes dangerous to be associated with the one who taught him about these interesting things about humility. The one who washed his feet now becomes life dangerous, and Peter literally or figuratively washes his hands. He experiences Christ's death and resurrection. Here's another picture here, and you see in the eyes of Peter how he's confused, how his eyes betray him. So we could linger here a long time to see what Peter is doing. One thing that has haunted me is that Luke has a very interesting point in all of this humbling of Peter. Luke says in Luke 22:61, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. This is at the stage where Jesus is being accused. And I didn't find a lot of pictures, but this is one. Of this moment when Jesus looks straight at Peter, and this is again an interpretation. I would say Peter caught a glance of Jesus' glance. But that glance is so profound, because here is the teacher, bound, being led into his trial, being led into the place of being accused of blasphemy, and then being crucified. His teacher is utterly failing. He's utterly exposed. He's powerless. And he looks at Peter with love. He looks at Peter and says, trust me. It's not over yet. We both have to go through this. I have to go through this to give you life. And you have to go through this to find my life as a servant leader. There's no other way. If you're a servant leader, you haven't gone through this, drive a bus for 2 years. It's an honorable profession, so long as you don't break the speed limit. But you see here also the rooster as the warning of Jesus that you will deny me. What is this denial? It's the antithesis to confess Christ. Deny yourself and follow me is the call to discipleship. Peter does the contrary. Same word used in Greek. He denies, aparneomai, Christ. Rather than to deny himself. Now, I had a student in the United States who did a thesis on Mark 8:34, if you believe that, on one verse. And this is what she defined. Self-denial is to abdicate primary loyalty to self in favor of primary loyalty to Christ. That's a good one. I'll repeat that. Self-denial is to abdicate primary loyalty to self in favor of primary loyalty to Christ. Self-denial doesn't mean finishing yourself up, making yourself into nothing. Again, identifying yourself as a doormat, etc., etc. We have pietistic descriptions in South Germany where self-denial is to make yourself as nothing as possible. And that's just so beautiful. The only problem is that you're still in control. And the call to discipleship, if anything, is to hand over the key of control. I'm sorry to tell that to Germans. Hand over the key of control to the master and to say, you are my life. You are the one that I seek to serve and to obey and to follow. And so this denial of Jesus is the description of the basic problem in our existence. When we go further down into humility, it's a question of you or Christ. Who holds the key? And I have lived many years as a Christian who would speak about surrender and the cost of discipleship and letting go, sacrificing a little money here and a little privilege there, while maintaining the sanctity and the sanctum and the temple of my own self being at the center, baptizing it with pious words of faith, but not really coming to the place of saying, either I abdicate primary loyalty to self in favor of primary loyalty to Christ, or I maintain the way I was born in sin, namely, I am in charge. I'm at the center. And so going with Jesus to this place is significant for Peter, because he will never for the life of him, he will never for the rest of his life forget the glance of Jesus. I believe he remembers that when he's being restored at the seashore later by Jesus. He remembers that Jesus looked at him, and perhaps he's looking at you. And he says, are you coming with me? Will you deny me or yourself? In the healthy way, not in the unhealthy way. So here's another perspective of that same picture. Another denial scene. I like this one. This is maybe for younger people an interesting description of the denial. It's the you see the power of self in this picture, and it really is hurting to let go of that. But there's again a sense here of I want to, but I can't. So anyway, we could spend hours meditating on some of these pictures. Here is yet another picture of probably Peter and Jesus. So anyway, I'm going to move forward here. I'm going to skip this. No, I'm not going to skip that. This is a tombstone of Johannes Rau. He was a president of the German Federal Republic. President, not prime minister. It's a little bit more of a decorative external thing. But the interesting thing is that he had all kinds of posts in German government in the 90s all the way till 2004. But this is what it says at the bottom of his tombstone. Dieser war auch mit dem Jesus von Nazareth. This one was also with Jesus of Nazareth. That's a strange thing for a tombstone, because it's actually the accusation against Peter. This one too was with him, let him also die. But either Johannes Rau himself is a follower of Christ, or somebody in his family circle thought this was a description of being accused of this one too. But he was willing to testify to Christ. So anyway, we go through the death and resurrection. This is Matthias Grünewald's resurrection of Jesus. If you ever have the chance to see that in Colmar, it's one of the most glorious oil paintings of the resurrection that I have seen. And why do I bring that in? Because Peter is being shaped by what Jesus does, not just by what he teaches. This imprints itself on his deep psyche, on his mind, on his life, namely, that is who my master is. We're moving on to number 4, and now comes a new phase in learning humility in Peter's life, and that is learning by doing. The best way for you to learn is to teach. The best way for you to learn is to do, to be engaged. So I think part of the commission to evangelize, to take the gospel, to make disciples is actually for you to become a disciple. So I would say Jesus is a very economical teacher. He says, Peter, I have a commission for you. I'd like for you to make disciples. By the way, footnote, as you do that, you become a disciple. So Jim Crook, I think you have done a wonderful job yesterday in emphasizing that. But I would also say there's kind of a learning by doing. So practice makes a master, and the master still practices. It's a movement, and I see how Peter is being shaped in being taken into the quick waters of discipleship. And I can certainly say, in my relationship with Mark and with John, I have learned enormously from these guys. They have shaped me. So I've followed God's way in being a little bit of a teacher in their life, and they have taught me enormously and shaped me by their questions, by their perspective in their lives. So I think that's a beautiful thing. As you take a step and serve the Lord in wherever place you are being trained as a disciple. And so here in Acts 10:11, we can't read the whole section, but we see there's a little bit of a geographic expansion now. He's getting out of his home turf, Galilee and Judea. So here he's going to Caesarea. And in Caesarea, he's supposed to give the gospel to a filthy goyim, to a defiled Gentile. Not only a defiled Gentile, but he is that this man that he's supposed to give the gospel to is part of the suppressing authority. So whatever country you live in, whatever oppression you have had, think of that. You're supposed to go to representatives of that oppressing authority. You have to say, there's some good news here. God forgives you. Okay, I'm foreshortening that. But the entire section in Acts 10 is one of defilement. He's defiled to be at the tanner. He defiles himself by this vision of having to eat unclean food, and then he defiles himself by crossing the threshold and coming into a Gentile's house. And the Holy Spirit falls upon this group. And what happens? It means that they have been purified in the atonement of Christ. There's no way the Spirit of God will fall upon filthy people. They have to be cleansed. They have to be purified by the blood of Christ. So Peter goes through processes of saying, I'm going to cut you a deal, God. I am going to be generous. The gospel will not only go to Jews, but it will reach all the way to the proselytes. But God-fearers like Cornelius, I mean, come on, we've got to cut some limits of where the gospel reaches. Do you see how Peter is still in control? And Jesus is still stretching his heart to go beyond and to accept the extent of the mission of God. Here is the angel that appears to Cornelius. There are not many pictures of that. And it's a disheartening picture, because here God is reaching out to an oppressor, to a representative of a very unjust system. It's terrible when you think about it. And yet there is an enormous power here of what the gospel does in breaking through barriers. Then, very briefly, I only have a few minutes, Jesus goes to Syrian Antioch. Do you see here? We're down here in Jerusalem, then Caesarea Philippi here, and then suddenly we're really going to the ends of the world. Peter is on a mission trip. He's the apostle. He can say things, and he associates with Gentiles. He has a great meal. And then there are some religious policemen from Jerusalem. And they walk in the door and they look around. And they see Peter sitting with Gentiles at the same table. And guess what Peter and Barnabas do? They get cold feet and they say, you know what? I think I've got a call on my iPhone, so I need to get out here. And so these people outside say, why are you eating with filthy Gentiles? And so Paul gets wind of that, and he stands up to Peter and says, you're compromising the validity and extent and reach of the gospel. And we don't know for sure, but I would surmise Peter takes it. That's so hard. Public leader, publicly challenged. I don't know if you've been in those situations, maybe in personal conversations, where you feel, wow, I really was wrong, but I really hate to acknowledge that. So part of humbling is to say, I'm secure in Christ. I'm secure in His love. And therefore, I can acknowledge that you're right. You've got a point. Mark mentioned that with David Redfern, that he wants David to speak into his life. Well, I hope you didn't miss that when Mark said that. That's a mark of a leader. Because false leaders will never want you to challenge them. They will punish you for challenging them. They will see to it that you lose your job. False leaders. A good, godly leader will say, thank you for telling me those things, but let me confess 5 more sins while we're at it. Because I am secure in Christ. And so we're slowly moving towards our understanding of humility, and that is something very healthy.